You are listening to the Nature's Premier Podcast, Episode 65, Women in Conservation. Here on the Nature's Premier Podcast, we talk about everything from bees to babies and sustainable living. Join us while we talk about natural parenting and different ways to live a more sustainable lifestyle for ourselves and our future generations to come. Now let's begin. Hey everyone, good morning and welcome back to another episode here on the Nature's Premier Podcast. I am your host, Brooke Nichols, and as always, I am so blessed to be here with you all today. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode. Today we are going to highlight 3 women in conservation. This is the second episode of our series of Women in Conservation, and that's when I take a whole episode and I highlight different women that have made impacts on our environment, conservation, and history, and really just try to tell their story. Now, when I first started this, I've started a couple little mini-series I have to follow up on. There's just a lot of content to cover, you guys, all right? But anyway, I really thought this was just going to be something that was going to be more, hey, let's highlight a couple different women of history, this will be fun, and, yada, 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 right? Just because, let's shout out some women, right? Let's do some women empowerment on the show, and let's talk about all the great things that women do. But the more and more I researched women in conservation specifically, I was shocked, you guys. I was freaking shocked. I can't believe how many people I have never heard about that have done so much for, whether it be for other people, for the environment, for even whole communities, that never get any clout, ever. Never get any airtime. Maybe they lived 200 years ago, but still, I consider myself a lifelong environmentalist. I've been a vegetarian since I was a kid. I've always loved animals. I have such a strong desire to help the environment, which is why I started my service. There's so many different things that I consider myself in my life, that I've done. And one thing is, I'm just shocked that with all the reading I have done, there are more and more people that I have never heard about. So that's why I have no idea how long this series is going to last. So probably for the duration of this entire show, because if I'm doing this one episode every 10 episodes, and I'm covering 3 women, there's a lot of women who are lost in the shadows, women of color that no one ever talks about, other women in different areas, poverty-stricken areas. I feel like you always hear of the same names, right? I absolutely love Dr. Jane Goodall. I'm a huge fan of hers, but she's not the only person that has, made strides. You have Dr. Mary Galdakis. There's so many different other people that don't ever get that notoriety. And it's a damn shame because there's a lot of women that just get very discouraged. They want to make their impact. So what I want to do on this show and for this series is to really give them a voice, is to just tell their story. Because if you tell their story, that's how your name lives on. One thing that we take with us when we pass away is our name. No one can ever take that from you. So, in theory, if you think about George Washington, or you think about, Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, you think about these people, they passed a long time ago, but their legacy lives on. So what I want to do is highlight these women and share their story and the impact that they had made on the environment, on their communities, and the people around them, regardless of when they lived. The first up in today's episode is Rosalie Barrow Edge. She was born on November 3rd, 1877, and passed away on November 30th, 1962. She was a New York socialite, suffragist, and amateur birdwatcher who, in 1929, established the Emergency Conservation Committee to expose the conservation establishment's ineffectiveness and strongly advocate for species preservation. She was the youngest of 5 surviving children of John Wiley Barrow and Harriet Bowen Woodward Barrow. John Wiley Barrow, a wealthy British importer and accountant, was a first cousin to Charles Dickens. In 1915, Edge joined the Equal Franchise Society, becoming a social activist for the first time in the women's voting rights movement. Edge gave speeches and wrote pro-suffrage pamphlets, and later served as the secretary-treasurer of the New York State Women's Suffrage Party under Carrie Chapman Catt. Rosalie began to take a strong interest in birdwatching in the 1920s when she joined ornithologists and amateur birdwatchers in Central Park. She was inspired to become a conservation activist after reading of the slaughter of 70,000 bald eagles in the Alaskan Territory without any protest from the leading bird protection organizations of the day. She also denounced the common practice of appreciating birds by killing and mounting them for study, regardless of species rarity. So she pretty much was the whistleblower for these organizations that are supposed to care about the animals, but weren't doing anything to stop this mass slaughter and, not protecting the integrity. Rosalie founded and ran the Emergency Conservation Committee from 1929 until she died. The Emergency Conservation's emphasis on the need to protect all species of birds and animals while they were common so that they did not become rare was a dramatic shift from the standard thinking and practice in conservation of only preserving species that had a quantifiable economic value. As a full-time volunteer environmental activist, she also asserted that it was every person's civic duty to protect nature, working through the legislative process to achieve this. One of her first undertakings as a conservationist activist was to prod the National Association of Audubon Societies, now called the National Audubon Society, which is currently in effect, to take much stronger measures to protect many bird species it had previously ignored. In 1931, Edge had filed a suit against the Audubon Society to obtain its membership mailing list. A judgment in her favor gave her access to about 11,000 Audubon members who were subsequently informed about what she considered lapses in the organization's defense of birds and wildlife. A bitter feud between Rosalie and the Audubon Society led to the resignation of its longtime president and a significant decline in membership. The break between the National Audubon Society and Rosalie lasted until a few weeks before her death in November 1962. So regardless of how big this corporation was, or this, organization was rather, she took a stance because clearly they weren't doing what their mission statement was saying. They were leaving many species behind, and like she mentioned earlier, preserving species that only had a quantifiable economic value. It doesn't matter if a species is only worth a certain amount, right? Like to us. It's still a species that's worth protecting. In 1934, after decades of hawk and eagle slaughter on a ridge in the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania, Edge ended the annual shoot by buying the property and turning it into a sanctuary. Willard Van Name, the American Museum of Natural History zoologist who advised her and secretly wrote her earliest ECC pamphlets, lent her about $500 to obtain a lease buy option on about 1,340 acres. In time, the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary Association grew to about 2,500 acres. In addition to founding the Emergency Conservation Committee and the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, Edge led the national grassroots campaigns to create Olympic National Park in 1938 and Kings Canyon National Park in 1940, and successfully lobbied Congress to purchase about 8,000 acres of old-growth sugar pines in the perimeter of Yosemite National Park that were to be logged. She influenced founders of the Wilderness Society, the Nature Conservancy, and Environmental Defense Fund, along with other major wildlife protection and environmental organizations created during and just after the 30 years when she dominated the conservation movement. In 1960, Hawk Mountain Sanctuary provided the scientist and author Rachel Carson with significant migration data that enabled her to link the decline in the juvenile raptor population to DDT in her best-selling book, Silent Spring, which we will get to shortly. Rosalie was born on November 3rd, 1877, and passed away at the age of 85 on November 20th, 1962. Rosalie was an absolute rock star, and especially during her time where women didn't have a voice, she took her privileged background and she really turned that into something to be used for good, right? So a lot of people could say, oh, well, I'm a socialite, I can do this, I can do that. But Rosalie actually took the reins of the conservation movement and just created a powerhouse of momentum through these organizations and really held these companies accountable. And she's someone that really furthered other movements, right? Like she was helping with the bird population. She was helping raise awareness about species that may have not had a large economic value in our eyes. She is someone that is amazing, totally someone I would have hung out with were she to be alive today. And I'm very moved by her story. And I just have to say, as someone who had such force behind a lot of the organizations that we know today, the fact that we don't know her name, or she's not a common, household name, there's a lot to say about that, that we don't push women enough. But now there is a name to the legacy, and that powerhouse of a woman that dominated the conservation movement in her era was named Rosalee Edge. The second woman that I want to highlight in today's episode of Women in Conservation is someone that actually was inspired by Rosalee Edge, who came about 30 years after her and who had used her research, like we mentioned earlier, and that is Rachel Carson. So you may have heard of Rachel Carson. She was definitely a pillar in the movement in her time as well. A lot of people know her from her book Silent Spring, but I did want to talk about her story because a lot of people don't realize how much she actually contributed to this movement. They think she was just an author, but she actually was someone that was also fighting for conservation and fighting for the right to, have these chemicals disclosed, talking about the health implication of these chemicals on the environment and on people. So I did want to share her story as well. She was perhaps the finest nature writer of the 20th century. She was born in 1907 and passed away in 1964. She is remembered more today as the woman who challenged the notion that humans could obtain mastery over nature by chemicals, bombs, and space travel than for her studies of ocean life. Her sensational book, Silent Spring, written in 1962, warned of the dangers to all natural systems from the misuse of chemical pesticides such as DDT, and questioned the scope and direction of modern science, initiated the contemporary environmental movement. So she was a huge pillar in this movement, and as you're noticing by the dates, that's really when we started to pay attention to how our actions affected the environment. Rachel Carson was a student of nature, a born ecologist before that science was defined, and a writer who found that the natural world gave her something to write about. Born in Springdale, Pennsylvania, upstream from the industrial behemoth of Pittsburgh, she became a marine scientist working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C., primarily as a writer and editor. She was always aware of the impact that humans had on the natural world. Her first book, Under the Sea Wind, written in 1941, was a gripping account of the interactions of a seabird, a fish, and an eel, who shared life in the open seas. A canny scholar working in government during World War II, Carson took advantage of the latest scientific material for her next book, The Sea Around Us, written in 1951, which was nothing short of a biography of the sea. It became an international bestseller, raised the consciousness of a generation, and made Rachel Carson the trusted public voice of science in America. The Edge of Sea, written in 1955, brought Carson's focus on the ecosystems of the eastern coast from Maine to Florida. All three books were physical explanations of life, all drenched with miracle of what happens to life in and near the sea. In her books on the sea, Carson wrote about geologic discoveries from submarine technology and underwater research, of how islands were formed, how currents change and merge, how temperature affects sea life, and how erosion impacts not just shorelines, but salinity, fish populations, and tiny microorganisms. Even in the 1950s, Carson's ecological vision of the oceans shows her embrace of a larger environmental ethic, which could lead to the sustainability of nature's interactive and interdependent systems. Climate change, rising sea levels, melting Arctic glaciers, collapsing bird and animal populations, crumbling geological faults, all are part of Carson's work. But how, she wondered, would the educated public be kept informed of these challenges to life itself? What was the public's quote-unquote right to know? Now, evidence of the widespread misuse of organic chemical pesticides, government and industry after World War II, prompted Carson to reluctantly speak out, not just about the immediate threat to humans and non-human nature from unwitting chemical exposure, but also to question government and private science's assumption that human domination of nature was the correct course for the future. In Silent Spring, Carson asked the hard questions about whether and why humans had the right to control nature, to decide who lives or dies, to poison or to destroy human life. In showing that all biological systems were dynamic and by urging the public to question authority, to ask who speaks and why, Rachel Carson became a social revolutionary, and Silent Spring became the handbook for the future of all life on Earth. Now, as you can imagine, a woman speaking up during this time in the 1960s, or rather, in the late 1950s, early 60s, the problem was that she was attacked. She was attacked by the chemical industry and some in government as an alarmist, but courageously spoke out anyway to remind us that we are a vulnerable part of the natural world subject to the same damage as the rest of the ecosystem. A lot of these testings that we were doing, that we currently do, that we were doing back then, nothing has changed. It's only gotten more intricate. It's only got more spread out, and we're only seeing the devastation that our testing and all these chemicals are causing on the environment. So what she was doing was saying pretty much, like, what gives us the right to try to alter the environment that we see fit. We're not separate from the environment. Like we say on the show all the time, everything is connected to one another. So you could turn around and say, oh, humans are this, humans are that. But guess what? We're all a part of the same ecosystem, and we're all subject to the same demise that the environment is, should we continue with this trend of destroying it. Rachel testified before Congress in 1963. She called for new policies to protect human health and the environment. She really was a pillar, and she stood up for what was right. Her books were absolutely, world renowned. People really did look at her as a, pillar in this movement, because she was someone that had a voice. She used it. She spread her knowledge. She spoke up even if she didn't want to speak up. She courageously spoke up, and she stood up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Unfortunately, she had an early demise. She had passed away in 1964 due to a long battle against breast cancer. Her witness for the beauty and integrity of life continues to inspire new generations to protect the living world and all its creatures. So Rachel was someone that was extremely intelligent. Again, she was courageous. She was someone that stood up for what was right, and her legacy will live on forever as long as we continue to share her stories and her sentiment that, the environment is not separate from us. Nature is with us. We are a part of nature, and everything is connected. So before I move on to the next Women in Conservation, I do want to say that Rachel Carson Silent Spring really did change my views as a child. It really stuck with me, and it's a book that I've carried throughout my whole life. So I highly recommend checking out her writings. She is someone that's absolutely amazing. If you have young children, have them read her books. They might be a little difficult to understand. Maybe, a little bit of an older audience after 9 or 10 years old or so would really find her books very interesting. So if we continue to keep this information moving forward to future generations, I think that will give us a really good leg up on fighting the current and future disasters that we face towards our environment. Our third highlight of today in this episode of Women in Conservation is going to be none other than Wangari Muta Maatahi. So for those of you who haven't heard of her, I'm going to talk a little bit about her story and all of the amazing feats that she has accomplished. Now, please do disregard any of the misspeakings of some of these names. I do so in such respect to everything that she has accomplished and to the areas of where she was born and raised and where she had lived. But unfortunately, it's just different dialect than English, and I'm not very good at pronouncing some of these names. So I just want to say from Jump Street that I had a little bit of difficulty pronouncing it, so please do excuse any mispronunciations. It's not out of disrespect, it's out of ignorance of me not knowing how to say the name appropriately. Wangari was born on April 1st, 1940, in the village of Ahithi, Nyeri district in the Central Highlands of the colony of Kenya. Her family was Kikuyu, the most populous ethnic group in Kenya, and had lived in the area for several generations. Around 1943, Maathi's family relocated to a white-owned farm in the Rift Valley near the town of Nakuru, where her father had found work. Late in 1947, she returned to the Ahithi with her mother, as 2 of her brothers were attending primary school in the village, and there was no schooling available on the farm where her father had worked. Her father remained at the farm. Shortly afterward, at the age of 8, she joined her brothers in the Ahithi primary school. At age of 11, Maatahi moved to St. Cecilia's Intermediate Private School, or Primary School rather, a boarding school at the Mathari Catholic Mission in Nyeri. Maatahi studied at St. Cecilia's for 4 years. During this time, she became fluent in English and converted to Catholicism. She was involved with the Legion of Mary, whose members attempted to, quote-unquote, serve God by serving fellow human beings. Studying at St. Cecilia's, she was sheltered from the ongoing Mayu Mayu uprising, which forced her mother to move from their homestead to an emergency village in Ahithi. When she completed her studies there in 1956, she was rated first in her class and was granted admission to the only Catholic high school for girls in Kenya. As the end of East African colonism approached, Kenyan politicians such as Tom Mboya were proposing ways to make education in Western nations available to promising students. John F. Kennedy, then a United States Senator, agreed to fund such a program through the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, initiating what became known as the Kennedy Airlift or Airlift Africa. Maatahi became one of the 300 Kenyans selected to study in the United States in September 1960. She received a scholarship to study at St. Scholastica College, now Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas, where she majored in biology with minors in chemistry and German. After receiving her Bachelor of Science degree in 1964, she studied at the University of Pittsburgh for a master's degree in biology. Her graduate studies there were funded by the Africa America Institute, and during her time in Pittsburgh, she first experienced environmental restoration when local environmentalists pushed to rid the city of air pollution. In January 1966, Maathi received her MSc in Biological Sciences and was appointed to a position as research assistant to a professor at zoology at University College in Nairobi. Upon returning to Kenya, Maathi dropped her forename, preferring to be known by her birth name, Wangari Muta. When she arrived at the university to start her new job, she was informed that it had been given to someone else. Maathi believed that it was because of her gender and tribal bias. After a 2-month job search, Professor Reinhold Hoffmann from the University of Gießen in Germany offered her a job as a research assistant in the microanatomy section of the newly established Department of Veterinary Anatomy in the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University College in Nairobi. In April 1966, she met Wangari Maathai, after Kenyan who had studied in America, who would later become her husband. She also rented a small shop in the city and established a general store at which her sisters worked. In 1967, at the urging of Professor Hoffmann, she traveled to the University of Gießen in Germany in pursuit of a doctorate. She studied both at Gießen and the University of Munich. In the late spring of 1969, she returned to Nairobi to continue studies at the University College of Nairobi as an assistant lecturer. In May, she and Wangari Maathai married. Later that year, she became pregnant with her first child, and her husband campaigned for a seat in Parliament, narrowly losing. During the course of the election, Tom Mboya, who had been instrumental in founding the program which sent her overseas, was assassinated. This led to President Kenyatta eventually ending multi-party democracy in Kenya. Shortly after her first son, Wangari, was born, in 1971, she became the first Eastern African woman to receive a PhD, her doctorate in veterinary anatomy, from the University College of Nairobi, which became the University of Nairobi the following year. She completed her dissertation on the development and differentiation of gonads in bovines. Her daughter, Wangari, was born in December 1971. So I did just want to give you a quick background because a lot of people don't know who she is, and she's absolutely amazing. She's done so much. She is just such an intelligent woman. She was really just such a movement and a powerhouse. So now I'm going to actually jump into her political achievements and her activism. Maathi continued to teach at Nairobi, becoming a senior lecturer in anatomy in 1975, chair of the Department of Veterinary Anatomy in 1976, and associate professor in 1977. She was the first woman in Nairobi appointed to any of these positions. Now, I'm going through everything because she is someone that came from a completely different country, just a whole set of cultural differences than where she was studying and where she was working, and the feats that she made were so incredible. So that's why I'm taking a little bit more time to really dive into her story. During this time, she campaigned for equal benefits for the women working on the staff of the university, going as far as trying to turn the Academic Staff Association of the university into a union in order to negotiate for benefits. So she was always fighting for women's rights. And she had a lot of adversity thrown her way, and she just continued to stay the course. Similar to Rachel Carson, she was just very, very determined to, fight for the rights of those who deserve them. We all deserve equal rights. Doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter your race, your creed, your economic, background. It doesn't matter who you are. We all deserve rights. Unfortunately, the courts denied her bid, but many of her demands for equal benefits were later met. In addition to her work at the University of Nairobi, Maathai became involved in a number of civic organizations in the early 1970s. She was a member of the Nairobi branch of the Kenya Red Cross Society, becoming its director in 1973. She was a member of the Kenya Association of University Women. Following the establishment of the Environmental Liaison Center in 1974, Maathi was asked to become member of the local board, eventually becoming board chair. The Environment Liaison Center worked to promote the participation of non-government organizations in the work of the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, whose headquarters was established in Nairobi following the United Nations Conference of the Human Environment, held in Stockholm in 1972. Maathi also joined the National Council of Women in Kenya. Through her work at these various volunteer associations, it became evident to Maathi that the root of most of Kenya's problems was environmental degradation. In 1974, Maathi's family expanded to include her third child, son Muta. Her husband campaigned again for a seat in parliament, hoping to represent Langata constituency, and won. During his campaign, he had promised to find jobs to limit the rising unemployment in Kenya. These promises led Maathi to connect her ideas of environmental restoration to providing jobs for the unemployed and led to the founding of EnviroCare Ltd., a business that involved the planting of trees to conserve the environment, involving ordinary people in the process. Now, you'll see this a lot with businesses that are coming up now that are saying, for every purchase, we'll plant a tree. This was kind of like the early stages of that type of movement. This led to the planting of her first nursery tree with a government tree nursery in Kararu Forest. EnviroCare ran into multiple problems, primarily dealing with funding. The project failed. However, through conservations concerning EnviroCare and her work at the Environmental Liaison Center, made it possible to send Maathi to the first UN conference on human settlements, known as Habitat 1, in June 1976. In 1977, Maathi spoke to the NCWK concerning her attendance at Habitat. She proposed further tree planting, which the council supported. On June 5, 1977, marking World Environment Day, the NCWK marched in a procession from Kenyatta International Conference Center in downtown Nairobi to Kamakunji Park on the outskirts of the city, where they planted 7 trees in honor of historic community leaders. This was the first green belt, which was first known as the Save the Land Harambee, and then became the Green Belt Movement. Maathi encouraged the women of Kenya to plant tree nurseries throughout the country, searching nearby forests for seeds to grow trees native to the area. She agreed to pay the women a small stipend for each seedling, which was later planted elsewhere. In her 2010 book, Replenishing the Earth, Spiritual Values for Healing Ourselves and the World, she discussed the impact of the Green Belt movement, explaining that the group's civic and environmental seminars stress the importance of communities taking responsibility for their actions and mobilizing to address their local needs, and adding, "We all need to work hard to make a difference in our neighborhoods, regions, and countries, and in the world as a whole." That meaning make sure we work hard, collaborate with each other, and make ourselves better agents to change. Maathi was truly a wonderful woman. She had such a heart of gold, clearly. She was extremely intelligent, and she had a fierce desire for change. She founded the Green Belt Movement in 1977, an environmental, non-governmental organization focused on the planting of trees, environmental conservation, and women's rights. In 1984, she was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, and in 2004, she became the first African-American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for her contribution to sustainable development, democracy, and peace. Maathi was an elected member of parliament and served as an assistant minister for environment and natural resources in the government of President Mwai Kibaki between January 2003 and November 2005. She was an honorary counselor of the World Future Council. Wangari passed away on September 25th, 2011 at the age of 71 due to complications from ovarian cancer. However, although she passed, she actually even received, after death, posthumous awards, recognition rather, from Wangari Gardens, which opened in Washington, D.C. It is a 2.7-acre community garden project for local residents, which consists of over 55 garden allotments. This community garden honors the legacy of Wangari Maathi and her mission for community engagement and environmental protection. The Wangari Gardens consist of a community garden, youth center, outdoor classroom, pollinator hive, and public fruit tree orchard, garden vegetables, herb garden, berry garden, and a strawberry patch. Within the garden complex, there are personal garden plots and public gardens. The personal plots are available to residents living within 1.5 miles of the community garden. Personal plot holders are required to contribute 1 hour monthly to the maintenance of the public gardens. The public gardens and orchard are maintained by plot holders and volunteers and are open to everyone to enjoy and harvest. The Wangari Gardens has no direct affiliation with the Green Belt Movement or the Wangari Maathi Foundation, but was inspired by Wangari Maathi and her work and passion for the environment. The The world is a better place because women like Rosalie Edge, Rachel Carson, and Wangari Maatahi were here. Thank you all so much for listening to another episode of Nature's Premier Podcast. I hope this episode inspires you to leave your own mark on our world, on our environment, and the people in our communities. Thank you so much again for tuning in, and until next week, we hope you have a wonderful, stress-free week ahead. Take care, friends.